name is Tracys Background. I'm your host of the Chicago Justice Show. I'm also the executive director of the Chicago Justice Project. Today's show, we are very excited to have a former intern of ours, but also a freelance journalist and law student, Jonathan Ballew. And we're going to talk about his experience covering the George Floyd protests from the streets of Chicago and some of his thoughts on the recent report released by the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General that looked at the CPD's actions in response to the protests and unrest that followed. But first, a little introduction. Every Wednesday, we have CJP Nation. It's the advocacy wing of our organization. We have well over 100 people participating now. You can jump on that link that should be in the chats now. It's a Zoom link. We meet every Wednesday, do some strategy, talk about the projects. You can get involved in crowdsource research projects. You can be a social media ambassador for us. You can be a legislative, help us with some advocacy on legislation, something that, while I'm going to keep a secret right now, there is going to be some movement in that area. I'm been told anyways around transparency soon, so I should probably have an update for you later this week. Once again, if you're interested in sponsoring this show, both individually and corporate sponsors, there's a donation in the link in the chat for a donation page. Please support our show, which is now going Monday, Wednesday, Fridays at 5:30 Central. We're moved to 3 times a week. And really quickly, before we jump on with Jonathan, I want to talk and draw your attention to a new feature on CJP's blog. It drops every Monday. It's basically a quick and dirty analysis of gun violence coverage in the city, looking at what we call the dailies, the television stations 257, 9, and Fox 32, and then the Trib Sun Times, looking at their coverage and how that coverage basically differs by outlet. And what outlets splatter their coverage on covering as many of the shootings as they can, what are covering almost no shootings. There's a lot of disparity. And I think it's interesting to look at how that changes weekend to weekend, how they define the weekend. So all of that's there every Monday. The link in the chat is to our latest version of that. And that's going to post every Monday afternoon going forward. So please check it out. Okay. So I'd like to welcome our guest here, Jonathan Ballew. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Tracy. How's it going? Nice to see you.
All right. So tell us a little bit about your background, because you didn't take the most direct path to both either journalism or to law school. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Let's see. I guess I'll just start when I was about 20. I dropped out of school. I was down in South Carolina and went and joined the Marine Corps. Did that for 5 years. Decided I was ready to hang it up and got out and thought I would come to Chicago. And I found DePaul and spent some time at DePaul's journalism program, kind of fell in love with it. And I did some work with NBC as an intern, and then I got hired by Block Club Chicago. And so I dropped out of undergrad again and worked with Block Club for about a year full time. Decided I wanted to go into law school, and that the daily journalism grind wasn't really for me. Still love reporting, still love journalism. But I decided to go to law school. And so I went back to DePaul and I finished my undergrad degree right before I turned 29. And now I'm in law school, and I am a second semester, first year law student. So I survived the dreaded first semester, and I am trying to survive the dreaded second semester.
Okay, so before entering, let's talk about, I want to get this because I'm really interested. I think you did some amazing reporting over the summer. I read some of the stuff you wrote about post your experiences in the Marines. You have to take an oath, and I believe, to support the Constitution and defend it. How do you think that colored and framed your view of the protests, of what was actually happening on the streets? Did it have no impact? Did it have an impact? Because I'm especially asking because I've always found it interesting that I've always thought, like, the military, even the police to some extent, you're supposed to be there to defend rights. And part of those rights is to protest. And you should be there to defend the ability for people to protest, not necessarily restrict it because that's part of what you're fighting for. Now, I wasn't in the military, so I may not know what the hell I'm talking about. So I'd like to hear your
Well,
thoughts
no,
about it.
you're not wrong, Tracy. You definitely take an oath of enlistment. It's called, you raise your hand and, swear allegiance to all enemies or against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And, I don't know the whole thing by heart, but they read it to you. But I guess in terms of how that would have shaped my feelings about covering the protests, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a great answer for you, just because by that point when I was covering this, I'd pretty much taken my military hat off, like metaphorically, if you will say, and kind of left it behind. And so I was looking at this scene as more of a reporter than as a veteran. I mean, I will say, I suppose military and police officers can be analogous in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways, I think we're very different too. So I wouldn't want to step in necessarily and take the role of a police officer, since I've never lived that life or never been a sworn officer. But I do think there's an oath that's taken by either profession. And I mean, you look at the side of any police car and you see protect and serve. So I think that's it's not really something that dominated any of my coverage, I wouldn't say. But I mean, I do think there is an element of, when you covered the protesters, you see one of their favorite chants is, who do you serve? Who do you protect? And so I think that issue is definitely framed by both sides in different ways.
Okay, in your piece, which I strongly suggest people read, what I learned at the Revolution in Chicago Magazine, I think it was published in June, if I'm not mistaken, June of last year.
Sounds right.
I
It
was
might have been
interested.
July, but June sounds right.
I was interested in your reaction to seeing a flag burned, right?
Ah,
Because
yeah.
that was something that happened, and usually when this happens, um, it's incredibly divisive. So
Mhm.
I just thought people should be able to hear what your thoughts were about that at the time, at least.
Yeah, I think even seeing, I had never really seen a flag burning in person. Obviously, I've seen on TV videos, images, but I'd never seen one in person. And I think I took that image that you're showing there. And I was, if not, I was literally right next to whoever else was taking it, because I was feet away
It
from
is yours.
that gentleman. Okay. And it was jarring for me, I think, probably as a military veteran, and, the pomp and circumstance and reverence we place on the flag. But I think, again, like I had been out of the Marine Corps for years at that point. And so, you transition into your civilian life as well. And, you think about, I went from kind of shocked and jarred to realizing, like, I actually felt a bit of pride that we live in a country where, someone can stand on the street and burn a flag, and that's okay. And you look at Texas v. Johnson, and that's a prime case of saying, we have the right to burn a flag, because we're not a country that's supposed to be sycophants towards ideology or symbolism, but we're supposed to be, protectors of free speech. And free speech doesn't necessarily mean things you like or dislike. I mean, obviously, we know there's a fine line between free speech and hate speech, but I mean, the flag is, government protest is one of the things that is protected. So I think I went from shocked at first to just feeling, I guess, a lot of complex feelings about what it means to be an American.
Oh my God, nuance, complexity. That's not allowed. Come on, especially in America now. Just be a sycophant, and you're good. You're a good guy.
Yeah.
From a guy living in D.C. and had insurrectionists standing out in front of his apartment building, all geared up. Mostly from guys who were very too scared to ever enlist in anything. I just find it hilarious that they all dress up in the garb, because it doesn't take some kind of courage to join the military. Anyways, I don't want to get lost on that rant because it'll just drag us down here. What made you, I think I got the date of Friday, May 29th. What makes you go to that first protest?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I wasn't planning on covering anything. I wasn't really a working journalist at the time. I was freelancing occasionally, but I obviously been watching what was going on with George Floyd and watching the protests spark up around the country. And I started seeing some stuff on Twitter about, some actions going on downtown. And I don't know, I've covered a lot of protests, but it felt like this was kind of a different moment. And so I just figured I would head downtown and I would just post to my Twitter feed, and just be there as a live reporter on the ground. It's the type of reporting I feel I'm good at. It's the type of reporting I feel like I have something to offer. So I just went and hit the streets, and I didn't have an outlet, didn't have any even plans to write a story. I guess I just kind of wanted to be there as a third-party observer, a trained observer, I guess, in a lot of ways, and just wanted to be there with, a camera and a notepad and be able to broadcast out what I saw happening on the ground. And from there, the next, as 3 or 4 days kind of spiraled into something I never would have expected.
And I want to read a quote. It's a little lengthy, but I want to read it from the Chicago Magazine article that has to do with pepper spray. Because you're a firsthand recipient of that, as we'll get to in a couple minutes. But
that wasn't my first time.
Oh, no, I am sure.
The military takes care of that.
Oh, yeah. And you could tell, I will say, we'll get to that, but you could tell from your response that it was not the first time, which we'll watch here in a minute. So there were moments when I understood from a tactical standpoint why police were deploying pepper spray. At times, only a dozen of them were trying to control hundreds, if not thousands, of protesters. But other times, it seemed like in retaliation or anger. Often the crowd would be complying with orders and pepper spray would come out regardless. On multiple occasions, I had to scream press and hold up my pass to avoid being directly sprayed. So how can you give our audience, because I agree. First of all, I'd say I agree that there's a lot of complexity to all these things happening, especially as that's going on. So I appreciated the not, I guess, all one side looking at things, because obviously, as we'll get to the Inspector General's report, the police were overwhelmed and unprepared pretty much from the beginning. But how many times do you think you saw pepper spray used when it probably shouldn't have been, or you didn't see a reason for it to be used?
Yeah, it's hard to quantify. A lot of it blurs together, and it's kind of why I'm glad I wrote some of it down, because it's hard to remember specific moments. But I would say, I wouldn't want to quantify it, but I'd say a handful of times I definitely saw pepper spray being used where, obviously I wasn't in the officer's shoes, but from my limited perspective, I was looking at it as, well, gee, it looks like that officer is telling a crowd to comply while pepper spraying. And I know basic use of force principles, and that's generally not how they're supposed to be used. And I think the Inspector General report backs a lot of that up. That says there was a lot of improper use of batons and pepper sprays. And a lot of the guys without any real training other than like maybe once or twice in the academy.
Right, and that's the hidden little fact that I don't think people are getting out of the consent decree and the civil rights investigation. I have sources in the department. One of my good friends has been on the force 15 years, and he's complained to me, I don't understand why we don't get use of force training every year. He goes, I've been on task force with the FBI and federal agents. They get use of force, hand-to-hand combat stuff every year. He goes, I haven't gotten any training.
Probably every month or whenever we're out in the field, we'll get escalation or use of force retraining. And, it's definitely not something you do one time. That's a disservice to everybody involved, civilian and officer.
Yeah, it's setting them up in failure, and you're putting them in situations where they're unprepared and then nervous for their safety, nervous about oversight, instead of acting on their training, which you can't do if you don't have it. For ladies and gentlemen, my buddy did not have prior to the civil rights investigation and then realigning some of the training. He really hadn't had any training since he was in the academy, which is just mind blowing. Like they would play a tape. Part of the civil rights investigation, they would play tapes at roll calls. You have video, and half the cops aren't watching; they're playing games on their phones or texting, and that counted as training, which is just mind blowing. Okay, another thing with another question from the article. You talk about an officer pointing a rubber bullet gun at you, and you realizing at the distance you were from him, it could be fatal. So a couple of questions right off the bat popped in my head. How did you know it's a rubber bullet gun? I'm surmising it's from your time in the military. And how did you know that that could be fatal at that distance?
Well, I mean, it looked like an M32 grenade launcher, honestly. But I know I was pretty confident that they weren't live grenades in there. So, the just kind of took sense that I knew that there was rubber bullet guns out there. I'd heard reports of that being out there, and it seemed like the only logical weapon. And it turns out, looking back at it, that is what was out there. But I mean, I just know that troops and on deployment and in training have had accidents with those where if you shoot someone close enough and you accidentally hit them in the head or a ricochet or what have you, people have died. And so I didn't really ever feel in danger throughout the entire time I was covering anything. I mean, obviously things were hectic and chaotic, but part of that is being trained as a reporter, part of that's being trained as a military member. But the time where I most felt not out of control, but maybe out of safety was when I saw that bullet gun pointed at me from like a very close range. I don't remember what I wrote in the article. I don't remember at this point, but it was close. And I didn't have anywhere to back up because I want to say I was on Grand Ave downtown, and I was coming up towards these windows and walls of businesses, and there were people on my left. And I mean, I think the dread-headed cowboy was on his horse, and things were going crazy, a little crazy, and there was nowhere for me to kind of be in a safe position, and that felt scary to me. But I mean, luckily we didn't see any of those deployed, at least in my perspective, so everything was fine. But I think that didn't sit right with me, that the officer went from having his weapon ready to at the ready, and that's a calculated decision tactically that anyone in the military would learn, or I'm sure police officers learn. There's a difference between being having your weapon trained down and having it up and at the ready.
Okay, so in your opinion, obviously it's only your opinion, when you think about it, did you think he was doing that because was he trying to intimidate you? Did you think he was actually thinking about using it?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think it'd be presumptuous for me to try to get into the officer's state of mind. But I didn't feel directly that I was able to say, oh, this guy's got malice and he's trying to scare people. I wouldn't say that'd be fair at all. I think the guy was just probably getting ready and just making sure he was in a good position. But in my personal experience, I wouldn't have that thing trained up that close at people ready to fire, So again, I know it's complicated, and this was happening in real time, and it's easy to judge the decisions of anybody 20/20 hindsight.
It is, but unfortunately, that's how let's hope they find some of these officers in these investigations. Because that's how police accountability gets done, unfortunately. Okay, I'm gonna play a clip now from your Twitter feed of you being pepper sprayed.
Okay,
and I want the public to see this thing.
There's no sound playing, right? Because what's happening right now is I'm screaming press, and we're backing up, and they're telling us to back up, and that's where he sprays. And from my perspective, and I think from the video's perspective, everyone is backing up. You can see me backing up. You can see everybody backing up. Nobody's going forward, and then the spray just starts coming out. And I mean, he keeps spraying a couple different times.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things I found about this is, well, I would say from a police accountability perspective, I would be very interested, one, if they can find the officer that did this, and I know you have a lawsuit going on, but also, I am convinced the police accountability stems from a culture within the department that doesn't let misconduct stand. Right. So,
Mayor Rahm Emanuel, acknowledged a code of silence, and that's been at this point acknowledged by most police leaders. And I think there's to some of that as a degree, but I think I think we saw from the Inspector General report that, there was a lack of accountability with body cameras or with arrest reports or with mass arrest reports, and that now even afterwards, like, they're not able to find accountability for most of these places because there was no body camera or there was nothing logged in even an incident report.
Yeah, and if people go on Twitter, the links in the chats. I watched the whole thing. It's about almost 2 minutes, I think. And there's an interesting point in there. First of all, you were incredibly calm. So I kudos to that. You kept reporting. You kept talking. I don't think any other reporter in Chicago would have been that calm. And I'm going to probably point at least to some of that you had been pre-exposed to pepper spray through the military, and that you were in the military, because there's no way I would have been anywhere near that calm.
Well, I'm sure we've got some of
to
some of the Chicago reporters are pretty hardcore, so I wouldn't say I'm the only one. I'm sure there's plenty of others. I know there's some guys on the street that I worked with in Kenosha who took some rubber bullets to the leg and the arm or what have you. So reporters put themselves, especially frontline shoe leather reporters, they put themselves out there. And you look at someone who doesn't have military training is up there on the front lines reporting live throughout this entire, I've got friends who were there at the Columbus statue, and some of them took batons, some of them had objects thrown at them. And so I think Chicago reporters are a different breed.
So everyone watch that video. Towards the end, getting to talk about police accountability, I thought this was interesting. You're discussing loudly with one of the cops, like, hey, your guy's spraying the press. And I just thought it was amazing. It's like, it wasn't me, man. Like,
yeah,
hey,
I think I was
did
upset.
something wrong happen? Right. Did something wrong happen or didn't? And what are you going to do? Your job is to stop bad things from happening and stop people breaking the law. I just found his nonchalantness about, it wasn't me. I don't care what happened. On video, it rather annoyed me. As a police accountability guy, when you get that type of response, it's hard to imagine things changing. Well,
I think in any situation, when you have, if the truth is that it's just a few bad apples, but if other apples aren't speaking out against the bad apples, then I guess that, what does that have you in any organization? There's a lot of code of silences in the military that have had to come tumbling down as well, because people are afraid to speak up against the few bad actors. But if you're not speaking up against bad acting, then you're participating in it to a degree.
Right. No, and that's the problem. Everyone says, well, it's a few bad apples. So the problem is it's the barrel not saying anything about the bad actors. Like, exactly. I don't think every Chicago cop, or even the majority of Chicago cops, are brutal or massively racist or anything. It's just that they will protect those guys to the end, no matter what they do, guys and girls, what they do. And that's the problem, is them not saying anything's the real problem. And it's hard. It's built in a culture that is long standing to not say anything. So let that be for sure. All right, I have a question, because this aggravated. I did not see this. I will say this aggravated the hell of me when I read it in your article. I did not see when this happened. So Saturday, after the initial round of protests, the mayor holds a press conference with Superintendent Brown.
I think that was Sunday morning.
Okay, let's say Sunday morning. And they're praising the actions of the officers. What were your feelings about that?
Yeah, I was pretty angry about that press conference. I remember it pretty well. And I think the thing that made me so angry was that I knew that how could they even possibly be praising either side's actions when there was no time to really review it all? You look how long it took the Inspector General to review the events of this summer, to come out and unilaterally praise officers. And you look at Mr. Foreman, the head of the police board, he's out there praising the officers that morning. And then I think the same day, hours later, he gets beaten by cops while he's walking through a protest. He gets batoned in the legs. And so I found that to be incredibly incensing and a bit condescending towards the massive amounts of protesters who were downtown, who many of them, it's been proven now, have received mistreatment. And I thought it was very frustrating, especially as a mayor who ran a progressive campaign, about bringing in the light. I thought that was very frustrating.
Yeah, I tell you, had I known that Gavin Foreman, who's the president of the police board, had participated in that press conference and said this, I'm quoting from your article, I would have not had, Gavin Foreman is talking to the superintendent. Now, ladies and gentlemen, he's head of the Chicago Police Board, which is the organization that is last in line around police accountability. This is what he says to Superintendent David Brown about his officers' actions the last 2 nights. I would not have had the same restraint that many of your officers showed last night. First of all,
I remember that one. Yep.
Gihan, you're a police accountability person. You don't show up and praise the police for anything. You don't know what happened. They may have been great. They may have been horrible. You don't praise anything. He should have never been at that press conference. And had I known this happened, I'd have been called for his firing. He needs to go. And I'm saying it now. And CJP is going to keep harping on this. He needs to go. He should have never said that. Should have never been involved in that. It's to at least me, it's ridiculous. He got called and he got pressured into going to that press conference. What does he know at that point? What does anyone know about whether the police did good or bad at that point?
I mean, on the ground
they did. That's all we know.
Yeah. On the ground reporters, I mean, we were still trying to make heads or tails of it. And I know that the police and the mayor's office has access to plenty of footage that obviously the general public doesn't. But I got to imagine that there's no way you could parse through that level of an event or a protest or even an uprising or whatever, what have you, in 12 hours. I just have a hard time believing that.
No, I agree. And he should not have been there, but he was there as a prop, and he did their bidding. And that, as a police accountability person, and when you're in that position, you shouldn't do anyone's bidding. You're supposed to be independent of everyone, the cops, the supposed victims or the alleged victims or the victims, however you want to phrase them, survivors. You should not have been there at all. So that really pisses me off. But let's move on. When did it first dawn on you, or when did you first realize that police officers were hiding their names and their badges?
That's a good question. I'm not sure when I first realized it. I got some tips that started flooding into me via mostly Twitter DMs, direct messages, just people saying, hey, I don't know you, but this is what I'm seeing, with some pictures. And so I got a call from an editor at the Chicago Reporter, Fernando Diaz, who is, I don't believe he's there anymore, but he's an excellent editor. And he called me just to see if we wanted to work together on something freelance-wise, because he'd been following my coverage. And so I had just happened to be DM'd these things about the badges. So I said, hey, I've got this tip. Are you interested? And so we started pursuing it. And before you knew it, I mean, we got hundreds of photos of covered names, covered stars, covered badges. Some of them were tucked in. Some of them had blatant black tape over them. Some of them weren't wearing them. And I was like, wow, this is not a one-off. This is an absolute, epidemic or a problem sweeping through the department. And so we started asking, CPD, COPA, BIA, Bureau of Internal Affairs. And so we started, poking into it and digging into it, and we weren't really getting any answers. No one was telling us really much. They were just saying that they'll look into it. And then eventually we did get some good information back. I believe it was from COPA, who was working with us. And we found out that, no, you know what? They pushed us to BIA, I think. But either way, we found out there were 78 complaints from civilians and otherwise about this practice going on. And so we wrote about it, and then we just kept writing about it. I think we wrote 2 or 3 stories about it, and I've yet to see a ton of accountability from it, to be honest with you, but I do know there are some officers who have been fired. I don't know specifically how many for that practice, but again, like many things that's been negotiated, we learned the hard way that this was an issue specifically that wasn't to be handled by COPA, but in the agreement was to be handled by BIA. So, you've got the cops investigating themselves for this, essentially.
Yeah, ridiculous. And once again, that shows just a lack of accountability. You're telling me, and this is, you have to do systemic accountability. You're telling me none of their supervisors noticed their badges and names weren't, or badges were covered?
We had white shirts that had their names and badges covered, I believe. I would have to go back and confirm that. But I mean, I have to confirm that. So but I believe that we may have had 1 or 2 that I have photos of.
Oh my God. I mean, that just shows you the rot in the system when they're doing it, and then they're not stopping it. Especially, it'd be one thing if these guys had it and then 10 minutes later their supervisor saw it and told them to undo it, or reported them for it. But the fact, it would be interesting to learn if any of the supervisors reported any of their officers for that, because the answer is no. but it would be
Well,
interesting to at least give them a shot to see.
And to be fair, the big comment I got a lot from, whether it be readers after the fact or some anonymous emails from quote unquote police officers, but I never got direct comment from CPD on this. But a lot of people were saying that these officers were afraid for being doxxed, or, having their address or home put out there and having their families be at danger. But I guess as someone who's been in the military, that argument doesn't really sit right with me, because you signed up to take this job and to pick up a badge and to pick up a gun and to protect your community, or everything that comes along with being a sworn officer or a sworn member of the military, etc. We don't get to hide our name badges. Like, that's just not something that we get to do. It's just like a politician doesn't get to hide from a reporter the same way a private citizen does. A private citizen has the right to say, I don't want to talk to you. I'm Joe Schmo. I live on Drury Lane, and I don't want to talk to the reporter. But, the state senator doesn't get to say that. When you take on a public role or take on a public position, that comes with responsibilities. And if you don't want that responsibility, then find a new career.
Yeah, listen, I understand the doxing, but you know what, officer? They can send a Freedom of Information request in, like I have, and have a listing of every officer and every badge number. That's a crack. That's a 100-year-old practice that they're now using a 2000 late teens excuse for why they've been doing it for over 100 years. It doesn't hold water.
And how about mugshots that are getting posted of people that aren't even they're just charged and they're not even convicted of a crime yet. So those people are getting doxxed. Many of the protesters got doxxed by CPD.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. No. Oh, it was an accident. No. Yeah, I agree with that.
Some of them are posted to the Twitter account.
Yep. All right. One of these things that also caught me in the article, this was about a protest in Uptown. And you're noticing of what you thought was private security, or an unidentified officer walking around with an aluminum bat in their back.
Yeah. Yep.
So can you talk a little more about that so the audience understands what happened there?
Yeah, that was after the Sunday night protests that went from Lakeview through Uptown, and it was large. It was really large, but it was very not much contention between law enforcement and protesters. It mostly went off without a hitch. There was a 9 p.m. curfew, and people mostly dispersed, but some people didn't, and I'm sure some people were just trying to get public transit. But, as you know, a lot of the public transit was shut down by the mayor and CTA during this. And so people were walking around, and I started seeing these guys with big aluminum metal bats in the back of their flak jackets that were just sticking out. They just stuck them in there. And they were just unmarked, silver aluminum bats. And I'm thinking to myself, what the heck are those for? And so I go see it, and their back says, I believe it says officers across their back, just officers. And their shoulder tape didn't say CPD. It said something security services or agency. It looked like a private security contractor, basically. And I just felt that was very strange, because it was just 4 or 5 of them. I think at least 3 or 4 of them had the bats. And I went up to ask them who they were with, and they refused to talk to me. And, I tried to put some pressure on them as long as I could. But after some time, you start worrying about your own issues first, because it was past curfew. And I mean, I had a press pass, but most of the officers respected the press pass, I will say, past curfew. But, it was definitely not a time you wanted to be on the street longer than you really needed to. But I definitely think that it's pretty clear, even from the Inspector General's report, that there were private contractors that were hired by the city for this, and those guys were probably some of them.
Yeah, because that's what we need. We need totally unaccountable people walking around the city with aluminum bats.
Yeah, I'm just not sure how you
de-identified.
uphold curfew. How you do uphold curfew with aluminum bats. That seems an improper response.
No, it seems like totally untrained yahoos giving carte blanche to act on the street like they want to. All right, so it's a great segue here. You mentioned the the report from the Inspector General, the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General. What stood out most for you in that report? I know you did a Twitter feed on it, but what stood out the most for you on that?
I think some takeaways were that I would say first that the mayor, Mayor Lightfoot, had a lot more influence in the decision-making than she led on during the post-press conferences and during public statements and during the months wrapping up. I think the report shows that many of the decisions, whether it be raising the bridges or use of force, use of pepper spray, etc., were authorized by the mayor, which I think makes a lot of sense. Obviously, the mayor, the police force falls under the purview of the mayor. I think that was my takeaway number one. I think the second takeaway was honestly how accurate Chicago's on-the-ground reporters were. I think most of the things that we saw and that we reported were confirmed in that report. And if you look at the footnotes of that report, you'll see dozens and dozens of Chicago journalists' work featured in the Inspector General report. I know my report with the Chicago Reporter was featured under the section where they talked about officers covering up their badges. So I think it showed that a lot of Chicago reporters got it right. And I think that it showed that a lot of Chicago police officers took a lot of steps to shirk accountability. If you look at the body cameras, I think it said a pretty high percentage of body cameras incidents weren't even worn. I'm trying to find it in the report right now. But 57% of force arrests were not captured on body cam, according to this report. And body cameras, as you know, Tracy, are supposed to go on during any interaction, let alone one that could be possibly use of force.
Oh yeah. So did you think the report missed anything in your opinion?
I thought it was a pretty thorough report. I thought it did a good job of just writing what they found and not editorializing. I think it did its job. I think the theme of the report was that the police officers were underprepared and not ready for what was going on. And I think perhaps that might be a bit watered down from maybe saying a little more honestly, like, look, a lot of officers did a lot of messed up things. And I don't necessarily know if that's the Inspector General's role to say that. But I think when you look at a lot of the actions that happened, I think that it was not an adequate response in a lot of different ways.
You are way too kind for that. Yeah. And honestly, widespread, unprecedented looting, most police forces are not going to be trained to respond to that all over the city, all at the same time. Incredibly, incredibly hard. But once again, we go back to they haven't had training in person mandatory since the academy. They're not going to be trained how to handle protests. It simply isn't true. This is a city that is.
If you don't mind me jumping in, since you
please.
reminded me of it, I read in that report too, something I believe it's the National Guard is not, because they sent the National Guard in, that they didn't want them responding because they weren't trained in non-lethal force techniques. And that one threw me for a spin, because I don't understand how that could be possible, because if you have National Guardsmen and they're only trained for lethal techniques, I don't know National Guardsmen's training, but I know that's not how the Marine Corps does it.
Well, it's interesting. I read that too. And the thing that I tried to...
senior official explained that National Guard troops generally are not trained in the non-lethal use of force, and that it was therefore high priority to avoid putting them in a situation where they would need to respond with force. And so, if anything, what are they really there for?
Well, my question is then, why are we have 10,000 troops around the Capitol right now, a few blocks from me, where I'm sitting right now? So they're only trained to shoot. Like, I think National Guard has been responding to protests and uprisings since we created them.
I think it shows that maybe the way we're training, be it our police or our National Guards, is, obviously we need to realize that dealing with the public, especially in large scales in protest, is never going to go away. That's part of being an American, is having protests, and that should be protected, rigidly. And so we need to train people on, I wonder a lot of times what would have happened if the city and the police force, et cetera, the powers that be, would have just said, let the protesters march. And on Saturday, they just let them march. And if they want to take the highway, they take the highway. If they want to take the Dan Ryan, they take the Dan Ryan. If they want to march downtown and block off every street, just let them. But from the first minute we were there, it felt like they were already corralling people and trying to put them in different boxes and splitting up the crowds. And it just created chaos, and it created pandemonium. And I feel like if you just had a unified group, of hundreds of thousands of people allowed to actually march and protest and demonstrate, be it if they want to come to Trump Tower, then let them. I just kind of wonder what would happen if we just allowed, when something is that big, and a movement has reached that level, trying to contain it seems almost counterintuitive to me. It seems that when you try to contain it, you can almost enrage it, because these are people that are upset, and for good reason. People are tired of seeing black and brown people shot in the streets, or murdered with a chokehold or a knee to the neck. People are tired of it. And so I just think trying to contain it so rigidly, I think actually ended up causing a lot of issues.
Yeah, and there's science to show, despite what you heard from politicians in Chicago and the head of the Fraternal Order of Police, the more you dress police
Yes.
up in the turtle suits and
Yep.
the armor and everything, the more you put them in that shape and in that stance and that response, especially the peaceful protests, the more you're
Yep.
inviting and encouraging violence than you are actually reducing
Psychologically,
it.
when you're down there and you get down there and you see the state police arrive in their full body armor, and their zip ties and their batons and their whole riot shields, and it raises the tension level. Even your general person on the street is like, oh wow, stuff is happening, versus when we were uptown on Sunday, there was hardly any of the same kind of force police officers. There was some guys with some shields, but for the most part, there was a lot less of a presence. And if you notice, that protest went off without a hitch, and that was because it was on the north side. And I think there's a striking difference of the response for the near north siders versus the south side or downtown.
No doubt about it. So the last thing I want to talk about is some body camera stuff that you mentioned a little bit. Cite some statistics from the report, and then get you to comment before I let you go here. As you said, 57% of force arrests weren't captured on body camera. 49 of the 113, or 43%, of reported uses of force weren't captured on body camera footage. Wow. The report indicates a high likelihood that many force incidents weren't recorded at all. I would say 99% of them. I may go off. I may be wrong. It may be 99.9999%. But yes, most of them weren't. And the supplementary sources suggest there were far more dangerous and potentially out of policy uses of force than CPD's official records indicate. Not a shock. And this is the last one that I find kind of interesting, because I think IAD was actually deployed at some point onto the street. The decision to deploy members without body-worn cameras, combined with obscured identifiers and scant development records, make it difficult and impossible in some cases to implement individual-level accountability for misconduct. No kidding. But my question would be, so first of all, that's all horrible. And yes, officers not wearing their body cameras or turning them off or not using them, awful. How do we still have cops who don't have them? How is a cop allowed to go on the street without a body-worn camera? This is just probably financial in my perspective, but I just want to get your thoughts as to close it out here.
I have a hard time believing it's financial considering the size of the police budget. But it really bothers me too, Tracy, because, when I was interning for you years ago, this was already an issue that was settled. This was already the police are going to have to wear their body cameras. This is the way. This is the new SOP, standard operating procedure. And here we are years later, and we're still dealing with this crap, quite frankly. And I mean, as I know I'm a journalist, but this isn't about being biased or not. This is the consent decree has come down. They've been told by the federal government how to act and how to operate. And then I cover a shooting in Inglewood weeks or even a week after the big protests, and the community safety team, who was created to respond to these kind of events, don't even have equipped with body cameras. They don't even have them on. So they get a back alley shooting, and it's the guy with the gun against the police officer's word, and there's no body camera. And this is just after the protest that went down in the summer. And so I think at this level in the game, there's no excuse for CPD not to have all of their officers equipped with body cameras tomorrow, March 2nd. And any day they go longer than that is unacceptable.
Yeah, I agree. I think that may have been reason enough to fire Brown, that he created that summer unit and didn't mandate that they all go out with cameras. He did a
That's unbelievable.
disservice. That's a disservice to all the officers. Let's say, for some reason, let's just say, hypothetically, that shooting in that alley, I don't remember the victim survivor offender's name who was shot. I'm sorry, too many of them to keep all the names all over the country in your head at one time. Let's say that shooting was perfect. The community's not going to believe it because they don't have a camera, and they view your camera as not having a camera as being corrupt. Right? You know how you get it by showing people video.
Well, that's the thing too. Here's the thing, Tracy. It's just such a no-brainer to me as someone who has worked a profession where I carried a gun. It protects everybody involved. I don't understand why this isn't being more. I mean, I guess I can, but if everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing, then body cameras are good for everyone. Because if, like you said, a perfect stop happens, a perfect situation happens, and an officer has to use their weapon and has to shoot, then the body camera is in the best interest of the officer. So there's really no argument to me whether you're pro-police, whether you're anti-police, pro-protester, anti-protester, whatever have you, you should be wanting police officers with body cameras on. And that's the first thing protesters would ask police officers is put your body camera on. And that's oftentimes why they would allow me to be ushered to the front of the protester police lines, because they wanted someone with a camera there. They wanted it to be documented. They wanted it to be so it wasn't our word against theirs or what have you. And it's just frustrating that we're still fighting this battle.
Yeah, I think that any officer that got found to have his body camera off during those protests should be suspended at the very minimum. It's just the whole thing. It's just obscene, and that's all on purpose. And we're talking, spring, summer of 2020, not 2005 or 1995. Yeah. Right? It's unbelievable that stuff still happens. All right. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. You did amazing work over the summer reporting on this. You were definitely my go-to Twitter feed for sure on that topic.
Well,
so thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it feels full circle coming from your intern all the way to your show.
I know. Thank you. I appreciate it, man. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back Wednesday. We're on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 5:30 p.m. Central. Next Monday, we have Deborah Witzberg, the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General, the author of this report, talking about the report and the investigation. And next Wednesday on the 10th, we have Alderman Matt Martin, and we're trying to get a couple more city council members to talk about what is going on with that community commission and why we still don't have one nearly 2 years after Lightfoot was elected, when candidate Lightfoot said she'd get it in the first 100 days. All right, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. We will see you on Wednesday, 5:30 Central, back here. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Jonathan, thanks again.